wonderful skill that you're speaking to, right? This idea of like, what does it mean to connect like everyday experiences with historical context? And we can do that because when we think about history, history really represents a collection of stories, and we
Hmm.
all have stories, right? I mean, we can reflect back on our experiences as kiddos, or even in recent memory, and those stories help to shape the way that we think about everyday experiences. That we could probably, throw out some word right now, and many of you could make some association that's connected to a story, right? And those are the kinds of experiences that we're really trying to draw on when we talk about this notion of Black history and psychosocial development. Because there's an emotional piece there that's really important
Absolutely.
to connect
Absolutely.
to.
I love, Joe, what you said, a teachable moment. I think Elisa, is that how you say it? This idea about flexibility, which I think is what Paulette is also speaking to, this idea of cognitive flexibility and allowing
Absolutely.
for impromptu ways to teach and inform in your classroom, but even flexibility tangibly in your
Mhm.
syllabus. That could be really great. I actually do that in some of my concentrated classes around race and racism. So I teach an African American psychology class, for example, and a multicultural psychology class. And that syllabus I actually don't completely fill out, because
Right.
I actually ask some of the students, what is it that you want to learn about or talk about? I mean, it's not really a democracy. There are things that they're going
Really,
to talk
really,
about, right, that they have
really.
to address. But I leave room in that. In my African American psychology class, I'll put longer spaces in between topic changes,
Hmm.
just in case something in the world pops off and we have to talk about that.
Right.
Right. It's so that I'm not now more overwhelmed or overtaxed or start to be drained
Hmm.
by things that should be exciting opportunities for teaching.
Right.
Right. So giving that
Yeah.
flexibility could help.
And I think sometimes the other piece that we're in some ways kind of getting into some of the recommendations that we're going to share,
Mhm.
which I think is fine.
Yeah.
But I think one of the other pieces, is just kind of building in for happenings of the world, right? I mean, things are always going to be happening, right? And
Hmm.
so, one of the things that I'll do in my syllabi is, in addition to some of the pieces that Andrea is sharing, I will also just I start with community check-ins and get a sense of like where people are in terms of what they're hearing, what they're experiencing, what they're seeing on social media, and how that's connecting to our topic, right? And so I teach multicultural and social justice classes, by and large, and so um, I'll ask my students often, so hey, I saw this thing on the news on CNN, or I was um, on some social media platform, and this thread came up. I'm wondering who also observed something similar. And it really sort of opens the door for students to know that they are invited to have those conversations in the room. And it doesn't, to Andrea's point, and some of what you all are sharing, it doesn't feel like that interruption. It offers that opportunity for a teachable moment, and it really creates the space to have those kinds of conversations routinely. One of the things that is so interesting about what we talk about as difficult dialogues, and is my belief, I'm speaking for me here, a part of the reason I think difficult dialogues are so difficult is because we don't do them often enough, right? We don't have them enough.
Right.
We don't have practice with them. And so when we provide space to have practice with them, they can become a bit more um, a bit more fluid and a part of the process.
Right. And less terrifying.
Hmm.
Honestly, part of it
Yeah.
is that we haven't done the difficult dialogues enough to know that you can live on the other side of them, or that difficult things can actually breed a lot of growth.
Growth.
Um,
Yes.
Awkwardness doesn't have to be avoided, that you can actually muddle through that sometimes.
Mhm.
Anything can be talked about. That's what you're teaching when you're talking, right?
Mhm.
That's a subtext. You may not explicitly say that, but that's what you're modeling for them. And
So I'm just gonna
oftentimes, and
flip to.
I think you guys could speak to this, is that people teach what they've been taught, right? Or how they've been taught. And so to model that, it creates ripple effects for these students. So here we have some recommendations. If you're the person that was waiting, that's like, right, what do I do? Okay, here you
Right.
go.
Yeah. So we're gonna
Things.
we're gonna backtrack to one of our other slides because just we've kind of gotten there organically in our conversation. So we'll do the recommendations and then we'll backtrack to
Mhm.
one of the other points that we're making. But go for it, Andrea.
You want to start? Okay, so I think I'll talk about kind of the bottom part, you can talk about the top half. So I think, first of all, when you're bringing up conversations like this, even if they come up on behalf of the students asking, um, what are you trying to do here? What's your actual goal? You guys had some really great goals, about making Black history a part of history, developing and creating this really development opportunity for the students, not just on facts. So if you identify some of those goals that you want with your classroom engagement, I think that may shift where it is that you end up. So if you don't have those psychosocial goals in mind, if you don't have that big, broad perspective, it may lend itself to a potential where you're starting to talk about certain facts, figures, all these kind of history lessons. And you're like, wait, where am I going with this? Or students start to respond and you don't have necessarily a goal in mind interpersonally in terms of the conversations or their development. It can lead you to feel a little bit overwhelmed as well. So identify the goals that you want for the lessons you have, the classroom engagements that you have, know where you're going to end, not just factually, but also psychosocially. Look at the whole person. I think you all want to do that. So that recommendation I won't spend a ton of time on, because I think that's a goal that you do have. But make that intentional, make that explicit. Learning on the whole person, not just on the cognitive skills and abilities that they need to pass the TEKS, because that is great, that is helpful, but I couldn't tell you anything that I learned on that TEKS, right? But I could tell you the way that I felt in elementary school, and we were learning about slavery and everybody stared at me. That's some of that kid logic that's still that ripple effect that I'm talking about. I can still see that part in my head, less so the standardized testing. Okay. So learn when you're bringing up this stuff around race, racism, Black history knowledge, understand how that might impact the entire individual. Now, this is difficult work. That's not easy to do, especially because people have varied racial identities, gender identities, et cetera, in your classroom. But I think that it does make for impactful teaching and meaningful learning. The third thing I will say, and I've said this oftentimes in some of my consulting work, in terms of allyship and allied support, I think that educators are in a wonderful position to be able to do that, particularly for the young folks. Model what it's like to sit with things that are uncomfortable and unchangeable without centering yourself as an obligatory solution to it. Okay. Some things in this world are really hard and they are unfortunate and they're tragic. And there's not a lot we can do about it. Okay. So maybe when someone, I'm just going to make up an example. Let's say that a Black male in your class says, man, I am so pissed off at this. Why do Black men keep dying in the streets without anything? Nobody's doing anything about it. Right. Rather than trying to fix that or centering yourself as maybe the problem or the solution, or how do I manage that? Model what it's like to lean into hard feelings that may be uncomfortable and unchangeable and empathize with that. Reflectively listen. Understand what it's like to have that kind of hard thing. Understand and maybe explicitly dialogue what it's like to not fully relate to him, in a way. Because then remember, children are learning, right? So the other children around you are saying, oh, you can say that out loud. You can do that. Even if we might disagree about something, I can still empathize and see you as a human and a person. Now they're learning things that you really want them to learn, right? So Colette, you go ahead and take it away with the topic.
Yeah, sure. Well, I saw a couple things in the chat as you were talking as well. So I do want to point out that folks are also sharing resources in the chat. Want to make sure folks can take a look at that. And someone also mentioned that in addition to sitting with this idea of or this experience of discomfort, one of the norms in their district, particularly around cultural proficiency, has to do with accepting and expecting non-closure, right? So recognizing that everything's not going to be sort of neat and tied up with a bow is what I'm gleaning from that. And I really think like the last point around modeling sitting with the uncomfortable and unchangeable, and even to the point of it looks like Chrissy, our participant Chrissy, who mentioned this expectation of non-closure, really sort of situates the first 3 points around creating, facilitating, and providing, right? So when we talk about creating space for critical inquiry, one of the first things I would encourage folks to think about is what exactly is critical inquiry for you? right? What does critical inquiry look like in your classrooms? Does that come up via questioning? Does that come up via conversation? uh, how do you think about critical inquiry, and is it something that's introduced to your classroom, right? Is there space for students to challenge the material that they're presented with, right? So that's a part of the way that I, for example, think about critical inquiry, and I suppose I've been that way all my life. When I was thinking about Andrea's story of sort of kid logic and our experience of um, hearing about slavery when she was young, it reminded me of when I was Rosa Parks in the second grade play. Like, best experience ever. But I also remember asking my teacher why I was chosen to be Rosa Parks out of all the people who wanted to portray Rosa Parks. And I realized that I was the only Black girl in my classroom,
Mm.
right? And so but my teacher allowed for that space. There was critical inquiry there, and there was a sort of a gentle way that I remember that teacher sharing with me the reason that I was Rosa Parks, right? Now, truthfully, many years later, there are a lot of complex feelings around that. But certainly, I think there needs to be that space to offer for those kinds of explorations. In terms of facilitating courageous conversations, we've talked about this a bit, and we were before we really got into the recommendations. The main point that I want to sort of drive home here is have those conversations often. The courageous conversations don't have to feel as courageous if we're engaging in those dialogues more frequently, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and, whether we're negotiating particular standards that are sort of handed down from state entities or from particular districts, or we're negotiating what comes up from particular textbook, whatever the case may be, there is going to likely be room for including multiple viewpoints. I can tell just from the conversation that we've had tonight that you all are creative enough to sort of curate ideas to bring in multiple viewpoints and perspectives to have these conversations. Again, though, the tricky part is being intentional about it. Like, that's the part that's hard, right? Because we can get into the day to day, we can get into the grind of like what it means to just do the work, and sometimes it can be challenging to remember that intentionality piece. And the final piece is sort of providing students with counter narratives. This is actually one of my favorite pieces in the sense, oh, but Dr. Bettina Love and abolish teaching, and I just totally got sidetracked. Dr. Love is actually at UGA, and so I've had the wonderful experience of hearing all about abolitionist teaching and a lot of their work. So I would encourage folks to connect with that resource. Okay, coming back. Um, so when we talk about counter narratives, as we described before, these are those narratives that really debunk those deficit notions. And so much of teaching, particularly when we look at textbooks, set up deficit narratives, right? So we have to be intentional as educators about turning that on its head and suggesting that, you know what, this is not what we're going to do in my classroom. In my classroom, we're going to provide perspectives that facilitate the whole person, that facilitate people being connected to who they are and the truth of who they are. I can't remember who it was that said that point about not lying to your students. It reminds me of that text, "The Lies My Teacher Told Me." And so I encourage folks to keep in mind that, when we're talking about counter narratives, you're really providing folks it's almost like a possibility model. It's an orientation of like what is to be, what can be, and what's possible, which we'll talk about a little bit in just a second. Anything you want to add, Andrea?
The only thing I'd add is that is a challenge to reflect on ways in which you've internalized detrimental narratives,
Hmm.
either around just Black Americans in general, or just around race and racism, and see how it is that you might be perpetuating narratives in your classroom unintentionally.
Yeah.
And so countering that for yourself will then have the ripple effects in your classroom as well.
And, that actually reminds me, I appreciate you bringing up this notion, like challenging. I would
Mhm.
also say challenge what you conceive of Black history to be, right? And
Mhm.
that's not necessarily up here. Um, I think most people have a conception of what Black history is, and it's really hard to get out of that.
Mhm.
So begin to reflect on what you think Black history actually is, and I would encourage expanding that for yourself if that's a part of what you need to do.
Right.
So we're
Even
gonna,
around the idea of limitations. Like I think
oh
with
yeah,
Black history, there's this idea that it starts and it ends. Like there's a way in
right,
which you can
uh-huh,
learn all about it. I don't know if that
uh-huh,
narrative comes from the fact that it's in a month, in a short month of the year, and it's named that. So you think, oh, by the end of the month, you've learned all the things about Black
mhm.
history. So you just have to repeat, rinse and repeat,
Rinse and
right?
repeat.
But expanding that, and I don't know if that goes with that global diasporic identity, but expanding the idea that there is so much to consume because here comes the counter narrative, because African people of African ancestry actually contributed much to this world, and they have much to
Much.
contribute to the world.
Mhm.
So there's that counter narrative, and then you've got this broadening, of potential resources. I know
Yeah.
it's 6:26, so let's go ahead and talk about this pushback a little bit here, if you want to introduce that.
Okay. So, this came up a little bit as you all were, as we were discussing earlier, in terms of, how do we begin to negotiate some of these things around Black history and developing our whole students when, spaces aren't supportive, right? So, if the stakeholders don't necessarily agree with what we're trying to do, then it makes the work a lot harder. Okay. And so, one of the things that Andrea and I want to be really intentional about noting is that there is likely to be pushback. There is likely to be pushback around even conceptualizing Black history beyond Malcolm X, Rosa Parks, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Like there's likely to be pushback to that. And what is to say that, or who is to say that we're prepared for what that pushback looks like? And so, what happens when that pushback comes from students? I think somebody mentioned sort of their students regurgitating what they heard their parents saying. Maybe there's a particular narrative there. And, how do we gently bring that perspective in while also acknowledging and allowing for that critical inquiry, right? That first, let me actually just pop to it real quick. So creating space for that critical inquiry, how do we allow for um, opportunities for students to ask additional questions? How do we bring up opportunities to challenge some of those narratives that are a part of their everyday experiences? And again, if we look at the data, we see that teachers have a particularly unique opportunity to shift and shape people's experiences and understanding of much of this history. Dre, you want to do the next one?
I think part of preparing for the pushback, I would add just two quick things. Um, under, Understand and kind of prepare for hearing things you might not want to hear. If you do identify as a Black American or individual of color, understand that there might be potential microaggressions that you might have to
Mhm.
experience. You might have to hear things from kids that their parents said, and it might not sit well with you at all. So I would say have a good social support system to be able to say all the stuff you would have said if they weren't the principal, right? Or if that wasn't Johnny's mama, this is what I wanted to say. Be able to do that, have an outlet for that, have a full range of emotional experiences for whatever that is, but prepare for that kind of emotionally and psychologically. The second thing that I would say is kind of prepare for the pushback in a way that you believe the counter narratives, not just as your personal opinion, but as fact and truth. So it's not just your opinion that Black humans are humans, that racial groups all have equal levels of humanity, that African history is a part of world history, right? That's something that just is true. So increasing your security level in that truth, even though it's counter to a long history of narratives that have been in education and throughout the country, is what I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other piece that I'll add, because I'm also sort of looking at the chat as well, there may be experiences in terms of this pushback piece where you're dealing with ideals in the classroom that sort of fall into what we um, find really sort of emotionally taxing and charging. I saw someone mention in the chat this idea of having folks in the classroom who kind of have ideologies that feel like sort of borderline white supremacy, is what someone sort of mentioned in the chat. And that, I mean, that's certainly a difficult experience to negotiate, particularly when your values, your experiences are counter um, to those that are presented in the classroom. I think what Andrea is sharing around having a social support system is incredibly important. And I would add to that is having also sort of an advocacy support system. And when I talk about an advocacy support system, these are other individuals who are going to be like-minded, who are willing to sort of step up to the plate and talk with administrators, be open to having sort of meetings with parents or whatever the case may be. It sort of depends on where you are, to help bring these conversations actually beyond the classroom and move them into larger spaces in the community. Because sometimes we exist in environments where those kinds of things need to occur, right? It's not
Mhm.
something that can happen sort of in this insular space that is our classroom, but maybe we're in smaller environments. I mean, um, I think about the space and place where I teach and work, and I mean it's not a huge place, right? And so when I think about how that environment is sort of situated, it can become important that those conversations step outside of the walls of that classroom and move
Mhm.
into community
Okay, great.
spaces. So
Thank
those
you.
advocacy pieces will be important as well.
I think so too. And also just to encourage people, I know how discouraging it can be when you're in the face of real pushback around this.
Mhm.
And it can feel kind of, what's the point? What am I doing? Is anybody supporting this? For me, it's helpful to come back to the fact that this work did not start with me in my lifetime and won't end with me in my lifetime. So I'm doing what I can with the body that I have, understanding that some of this work may cost me something. There may be a sacrifice there of whether that's approval, or relationships or what have you. Um, but it's a worthwhile cause if you are someone who desires to be an advocate in education truly and meaningfully, and not just perceived as one. So if that's anything to encourage you, that even just moving the needle a little bit, I think speaks volumes to your kids of color in the classroom, but also just helps with the kind of journey that we're all on in the fight towards
Mhm.
racial justice.
Absolutely. And while we've been having conversations like this for a long time, the reality is like the fact that we're sitting here together as a group and engaging right now around this topic is to suggest that the needle is moving, right?
Yeah.
It may be moving slowly, but
Mhm.
we're continuing to push forward. And so, as we wrap our time together, I want to share with you another one of my favorite quotes. Guess you've learned about me this evening that I love a good quote. That
She
is
loves a
true.
good
I
quote.
love a good quote. And this quote comes from Karinga. And Karinga notes that the history is the substance and the mirror of a people's humanity in others' eyes as well as in their own eyes. It is not only what they have done, but also a reflection of who they are, what they can do, and equally important, what they can become as a result of the past, which reveals their possibilities. And so, we conclude today by really reflecting on the fact that we're talking about possibility. That's what this entire discussion is really about. It's about future possibilities of the students in your classrooms and how you serve as such an important part of shaping those future responsibilities, those future possibilities. And it's very clear that you all take that responsibility quite seriously. After all, you're here. And so um, with that, we just want to um, offer opportunity to ask for any comments, any questions, extend our sincere thank you for you all being such an just an awesome audience and being so engaging and transparent. It's been a lot of fun to spend this time with you all this evening.